Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'll try and shout over is that the James Cleverly campaign theme tune? I think it is. Thank you very much for joining us again on another packed event. This is our final PopCon event here in Think Tent, so thank you for joining us. And I think this is going to possibly be the best event in the Think Tent this year. This is our fourth and final PopConversation. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the director of the Popular Conservatives. And my guest this afternoon has been the intellectual inspiration for much of the Popular Conservative agenda. I would say he is the leading conservative public intellectual in the United Kingdom today. He's a well-known, respected author and historian, particularly on the kings and queens of England. He presented 4 seasons of Monarchy on Channel 4 during the 2000s. He's most recently authored Henry, Model of a Tyrant, and Magna Carta, the true story behind the Charter. In more recent times, he's become famous to a whole new audience through his YouTube channel, David Starkey Talks. Please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to the brilliant, to the erudite, Dr. David Starkey.
The rickety start.
It's going to get better from here.
It'll get better.
David, thank you very much for joining us and all the help and assistance you've given this new but growing movement of popular conservatism. You argue for, as do we in Popular Conservative, and everybody nods sagely typically in the room, that we need a constitutional restoration in the United Kingdom to undo a lot of the vandalism and damage that's been done to our governmental and constitutional structures. Tell us a bit about what a constitutional restoration really means. I think when we first met and discussed this, I was saying we need to be radical, we need a revolution, and you were insistent, I must use the term restoration. It's about going back to something we previously had. What is it? What is the constitutional restoration that the United Kingdom needs?
Well, look up here. Popular Conservative. The foundation has to be the idea that the source of law is you. It is the idea of consent, the idea that Parliament is not what people like Dominic Grieve and John Bercow thought, a little group of privileged people that look at you and think you don't quite understand and your betters need to do it for you. It is the fundamental idea that goes right back, not quite to Magna Carta, but very nearly, that Parliament binds because everybody in England is there in person or by their representative. And the great key to understanding the Blair catastrophe is this strange paradox of the Labour Party that was founded as the Popular Party, which decided the people could not be trusted. And every single thing that is done from 1997 to 2010, and they're at it now again, is designed to stop you having any direct influence on policy and to transfer it to judges, to transfer it to quangos, to transfer it to these very strange... What is so wrong with a quango? I'll answer in one word, it's COVID. The model of this kind of government, the hideousness of what was created from 1997 to 2010 is COVID. It's lockdown. It was imposed by a single issue committee. There is no worse way of governing anything than by a single issue committee. It's by definition a collection of fanatics. Isn't it? The only thing that they cared about was stopping any COVID death at any cost, at any cost to the economy, at any cost to education, at any cost even to any other way of dying. You were going to be offered no choice. You died of COVID in the NHS or nothing, and so on. And it is this absurdity of the rule of the single issue expert, which covers everything, the Bank of England's policy, set up by the Monetary Policy Committee, established by Gordon Brown, climate change, set up by the Climate Change Committee, English nature. And so there's then this extraordinary, deliberate taking out of control from Parliament. Why? Because finally, look, let's face a truth. Many MPs are hopeless. Indeed, it could strongly be argued most MPs are hopeless. However, we can get rid of them. You cannot get rid of the Climate Change Committee. You cannot get rid of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, although it has debauched the currency as much as was done in the 1970s. So we've got to get back to this central idea that Parliament answers to you, and therefore Parliament must control the rest of the machine. That is the only way it can be done. The other great area, of course, just quickly, alongside the expert, is the dreadful cementation of all of this with the dominance of the lawyer. The complete misunderstanding of the rule of law becoming the rule of lawyers, and with, of course, what we can all now see when I put together the expert, the lawyer, the self-aggrandizing, the absolute quintessence, the achievement of New Labour is Keir Starmer. He represents everything that is wrong. And moreover, we can draw great, I think, enormous comfort. This Labour government is bound to fail, and bound to fail badly, because it is the system. We all recognise the system needs changing. It can't do it.
This is fascinating. And what do you trace this particularly or even exclusively from May 1997 and the rise of Blair?
I was blind, like everybody else. I began to get glimpses of it because I've always been interested in politics. I began to look at it almost from the sideways. I got very interested in the comparisons between Boris Johnson and the Welsh wizard, Lloyd George, when the creation of the Cabinet Office happens at the height of 1916. But he was actually meeting somebody who had been at the heart of the process, Oliver Lewis, who had been principal spad to David Frost. And we had this extraordinary, I mean, usually dinners are just nice and drunken, and you talk about the food, you know. And we did get mildly drunk, and we talked a lot about the food, and we ate, I can even remember, it was rognon de veau in a very rich sauce. But he was telling me all the time what had gone wrong. And he described it, this horrible word, granular, a bit like the kidneys, I suppose. He described it in this extraordinary detail. He talked me through what had happened, why it was impossible to do anything. That, in other words, we finished up with the comparison of Britain, this extraordinary country that has given so much to the world. At the moment, I'm sure you're all familiar with Gulliver's Travels. We're now like Gulliver in Lilliput, this great giant prone, tied down with lots and lots of little bands that stop anything from happening. So in other words, when we talk about the Constitution, it can sound terribly vague and elevated, but in fact, our economic crisis is directly related to this, because it is this multiplication which stops anything being done. And so, you know, we're in the absurd position. The judges determine what? They actually determine whether oil drilling or fracking or coal mining can take place. Judges determine wages. It's demented.
And so if we were to start from 97... although it might predate that, I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether us joining the European Economic Community also put us on this path. But let's say it at least...
Can we just deal with that
sure.
first? You see, I think, again, this is where Brexit went wrong. We didn't think about it fundamentally, and we never really explained it fundamentally. Remember, the origins of the EU, let's go back right to the beginning, the Coal and Steel Federation. The Coal and Steel Federation is in the immediate aftermath of war. It's the reconciliation between France and Germany. But it's based on the idea the people should not be in charge because the people had voted for Hitler. And repeatedly you see all European constitutions are deliberately designed to exclude as much direct popular authority as possible, and the quintessence of that is, of course, the EU. The trouble was, when we went into it, we tried to, by the simple act of translating, we changed it into our way of thinking. So everybody called, very foolishly, the Commission of the EU, they called it the civil service. It's not. It's what the French mean by a bureaucracy. Bureaucracy means ruling. It means the administrative elite actually rules. And remember, we've got a radically different tradition on either side of the Channel. I mean, I've got several jokes about France. The best is all bad ideas are French. And the second is that the Channel is the widest strip of water in the world. And we're the missing halves of a perfect civilization. We do everything differently. But think about, let's just look at this issue. Let's look at why the French find it easy to do railways and we find it difficult. France has a completely different meaning of the idea of the public interest. L'intérêt public in France is not determined, we determine it by a public inquiry. We'll have every single competing interest who yell at each other with sophisticated QCs, and we take 30 years to do it. France, a bureaucrat decides this is a good idea. Remember, a minister in the French government is actually preceded by a gentleman usher in a white tie carrying a wand. That is, it's the power of the ancien regime. It's all European governments are essentially lightly disguised absolutist governments. So in France, when they want to build a railway, there are two calculations. Do we do it by bribing or by bullying? It's very simple, and we need to understand that. It's a different way of doing it.
So let's roll forward to 97. Tell us how you think the incoming Blair government, and some similarities with today, after a long period of Conservatives in power, Labour comes in on a landslide, although probably with somewhat more hope and optimism and enthusiasm from the hugely more than the electorate had for the Labour Party this time round. What do they do to damage, vandalise or erode the Constitution? What are the particular steps? And why do they matter? What's the impact of these various moves that Blair takes?
They come in, I think, and we really need to be quite clear, the dominant figure in this is Gordon Brown. And Gordon Brown is a malign genius. He was a dreadful prime minister, but he has got the intelligence, the grasp, the knowledge of history to do this. The first enterprise was deliberately, essentially, to break up and reinvent Britain. When Blair talked about a new country, we all giggled our heads off. And in fact, we were given a new country. And the first thing was devolution. Remember, the way Britain had worked, and this again is where the Scott Nats get it so badly wrong, Britain was always, and this again comes right back to the whole argument about what we are, senses of nationhood, identity. We have never been a unitary people. We never called ourselves Britons. Britons are naked and wear woad, right? And I haven't seen many examples of that here. I mean, many eccentricities, but not quite that. We were always domestically Scots, Welsh, Irish, English. And the foundation was a union of equal people, despite the fact Scotland is so much smaller than England and so much poorer. But what happened was everybody was both Scottish and British, English and British. But the British bit was really Anglo-British. The Parliament, into which the Scots were greatly overrepresented, was the old Parliament of England, going back to Magna Carta. The monarchy is the monarchy of England. Now, New Labour does not like this. It doesn't like the monarchy. It doesn't like the idea of allegedly central control. And what it deliberately does, it breaks the unity of Britain.
Through the devolution measures?
Devolution. And devolution is utterly fundamentally important because it goes along with a deliberate reinterpretation of our history. The historical profession has a huge measure of guilt. People like Linda Colley and Norman Davis write effectively propagandist histories of Britain which are designed to underpin the Labour enterprise. Because the only thing that had unified the old Britain was the monarchy. That is pushed to one side. That delicate edging of the Queen by Tony Blair, that patronage, was profoundly symbolic. And instead, you come up with this strange thing called a new British identity. And what does it consist of? Three things. Legal identity, our citizenship. Secondly, diversity. And thirdly, tolerance. In other words, we've substituted the real passionate identities of the old Britain with what is purely a flag of convenience. And this is what has opened the whole way to the kind of crisis of immigration. But we've equally, because everything is double. The strangeness of the fact that we never had a unitary identity. Remember, the first internationals, soccer internationals, football, is Scotland versus England. It's why there's, you're a football fanatic, why there's never been a British football team. All of that's there. But we never had anything the French or the Americans or the Germans did, which is a single educational system designed to inculcate a single set of values. With Catholic schools, with Jewish schools, with non-conformist schools, with public schools, with private schools, with an entirely separate educational system in Scotland. That's one way that we've been able to absorb immigrants, because unlike the French, we haven't sought to impose a particular identity. But the problem is that if you have this fuzzy notion of purely a kind of flag and convenience identity, you can get away with Salford, you can get away with Rotherham, large chunks of the East End of London. That was all deliberate. And again, the problem is England has always been different from Europe. I described the completely different concept of law, which rests on popular consent. That is the antithesis of Europe. It's the antithesis of New Labour. And what we've really got to understand, we are now in a genuinely existential dispute within Britain. What is the source of public authority? Is it you and me and all the rest of us with our collective consent? Or is it the result of a higher authority as expressed through legal expertise and a notion that there's this bizarre thing, the second thing that comes in 1997, universal or European human rights? Where does the authority of these things come from? What is the continuing authority of the European Court? It's a mystery, it's a mysticism that's been put upon us. And of course, what it effectively does is to concede, as Robert Jenrick has been saying, and get a lot of flack from it, from ex-Tories, very, very ex-Tories. What it's done, it means that the authority of the people, which I think should be the only source of law, has simply been marginalised. It's been shifted. We've exported it. It's inconceivable.
So we've got the devolution to Scotland.
Incorporation of the human rights.
The Human Rights Act. What else is on the crime sheet?
Well, let me just finish human rights. Universal human rights effectively abolish the state. If there's such a thing as universal rights, it means we're all the same. Did you notice the extraordinary business of the Rwandan Welshman who murdered lots of people? People were claiming somehow he was British. I mean, this absurd notion that we're all fundamentally the same. If we are conservatives, we've got to believe in history, in culture, in locality and place. So, and again, of course, it abolishes frontiers. Which is why, again, if people like the Refugee Council and whatever he's called, Solomon, who run it, if they were honest, they should say everybody should be able to come in. There should be no border service. This, which again, you can see in Europe with Schengen, they were coming very near to that idea. And now, of course, they've hit the buffers. Right. Then giving the kind of overarching, capping thing to this is the replacement of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords with a Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is or should be Parliament.
What was behind that? What was? I mean, everybody.
It was vanity.
Yeah, everybody almost treated that at the time, if I recall, as a cosmetic gesture that made us look more modern. But what's the actual impact on the way the law works?
The actual impact is called Brenda Hale. And it is the extraordinary decision of the Supreme Court which actually overrules the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, overrules prorogation. And again, it was done on juju. It was done by Lord Panic, who is brilliantly good at constitutional juju, but it's outrageous. The foundation of our modern constitution is the Bill of Rights of 1689, which draws this rigorous distinction between the judicial and the political. Everything that New Labour has done, you see again Keir Starmer, is the absolute, the concentration of this. We confuse the boundaries. the whole way in which quasi-legal process was used to destroy Boris Johnson, who, by the way, I think deserved it, but it's how it was done. It seems to me if a politician fails, they should fail politically, not by quasi-judicial process. I mean, we used, back in my day, I don't mean my actual day, people think I'm so old, I probably shook Henry VIII's hand as he was dying. This is not true. Back in the 16th, 17th century, if you fell politically, you were also destroyed legally. And the great triumph of Britain at the beginning of the 18th century, the last person to be dealt with under this procedure was the Earl of Oxford, and we stopped doing it. So you fall politically, but you're not destroyed financially, you're not destroyed socially. And all of that's been eroded by that. But of course, it acts as the coping stone on the arch, because again, all sorts of things, and the Conservative Party played a disgraceful part in this process. The Climate Change Committee is essentially our work. Yeah. But once you have a climate change committee, which consists of single-issue fanatics, supported by, outrageously, an entire lobby, quasi-charitable lobby that we finance. I mean, the preposterous thing. But what's even worse, Theresa May was fool enough to legislate 2050 actually as a binding legal target, which gives the Supreme Court the right to set planning policy, to set energy policy. I mean, the derangement of this.
And I'm intrigued by this as well. So we've got a whole litany of disasters wrought by Blair, you're saying. Devolution, the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act. The Equality Act.
Now, the Equality Act is wonderful. Did you know, you might have thought, I mean, anybody here who's even familiar with elementary economics knows that the way Adam Smith describes how wages are set is by the market, right? Market demand. Do you know what the Equality Act incorporates? It incorporates 3 equations by which judges can determine the absolute fairness of wages in accordance with the Marxist theory, labour theory of value. Yep. It's actually written into parliamentary statute, which is why this city was bankrupted. And when the ruling took place, that cleaners were paid less appropriately than dustmen. How do you weigh a cleaner against a dustman? It's deranged.
And of course, Next, the clothes store chain, have just lost a battle on this as well.
Next, exactly. It's about to go bankrupt. It's about to go bankrupt.
Yeah, so there was whether people in the warehouse, working in the warehouses, were paid more than people working on the shop floor.
Ladies in the makeup counter, smelling sweetly. Yeah.
And the court ruled that these were, these people were sort of working equally hard and therefore should be remunerated.
It assumes that there is an intrinsic measurable value in labour. It's deranged. And then, of course, the problem with equalities is that, in fact, it's the inequality. This is the wonderful thing about the left. They've captured language. Equality sounds wonderful. It's actually inequality, because what you do is you privilege minorities. And again, one of the striking things, so in other words, what we should be campaigning for, and let's get this point out and then quickly go back to the Supreme Court, what we should be campaigning for is one equality. We need only one equality. I speak as a gay man. I speak as somebody who was seriously involved in the equalisation of the age of consent. We need only one equality, which is what I campaigned for: equality before the law. The same law applies to everybody. And until we do that, we are lost. Every single competing group will come up with Islamophobia, black right, systematic racism and whatever, and we will fragment more and more and more into rival factions. We'll have a politics of terrible sectarianism. But just quickly going back to the Supreme Court, the point that was made by Bingham, there were 2 elements in the Supreme Court. One of them was the most narrow political calculation. Blair wanted to get rid of his mentor. He wanted to get rid of the sort of Cardinal Wolsey Lord Chancellor, so you demote the office of Lord Chancellor. But Lord Bingham...
This was Derry Irvine.
This Derry Irvine. He wanted to get rid of him. But the more important thing was that Bingham, the senior law lord at the time, came up with this novel idea, and again we need to understand it. What they legislated for was the fundamental purpose, listen to this carefully, of democracy is to protect minorities. Now, that's the route down which we've gone. And you can see we've completely changed the meaning of language. Democracy means one thing: majority rule. So if you're all wondering why we've got this funny word populism, it is because this elite has misappropriated the word democracy and has redefined it as a network of legal protections to protect what? The minorities against the majority. And this is why human rights have stood completely on their head. Let nobody tell you, oh, Churchill was responsible. What Eleanor Roosevelt thought human rights was about was the protection of the rights of you and me against the state.
Yeah.
If the protection of minorities is the first issue, the state has got to protect the minority against you and me. So do you see what I mean? Throughout all of this, you've stood everything that we thought we knew about words, our country, our values, deliberately on its head, which is why, you know, those poor folk in the north of England, where I come from, with the riots, why there was that heartfelt, inarticulate cry, we want our country back. It's been taken away. We've stepped through a mirror into this bizarre Blairite Alice in Wonderland world.
And now, David, tell me what goes wrong when the Conservatives return to office in 2010, albeit in coalition initially, but we've just had 14 years of Conservative government. Why wasn't this analysis front of mind?
Because
did they warmly embrace what's been done, or did they just not think it was important?
It was even worse. Blair's memoirs by Michael Gove were handed in a listen to this, were handed in a marked up copy round the cabinet table, telling them this was how to do government. Can we just spell that out again? These were not, as it were, just walking into it. It wasn't the result of the Conservative Liberal coalition. It was an absolutely deliberate decision to embrace it. But it goes back even beyond 2010. It goes back to 2005 and Cameron's taking over the party. The first thing he says in 2005, I want this to be a party that welcomes liberals. So you get Caroline Noakes, and you get the idea that it is Tory to have self-recognition of transsexuals. I mean, can there be anything more demented?
And so, now, what you've actually said, David, is not only, what's this been injurious to? You've mentioned the economic plight that we find ourselves in. Not, if you like, not since 2008, a particular date of catastrophe, but general, sort of stagnation, virtually zero economic growth. What about unrest? Even if it isn't manifested in the forms of violent riots, a general sense amongst an ever bigger part of the malaise, a detachment, a feeling of being dispossessed, no longer really part of the system. Tell us a bit about, what have these symptoms been over the 14 years in which, and why weren't the Conservatives able to observe them and then correct them?
The trouble is, I think that, the way I would try to explain it is that there are moments when, not moments, there are powerful groupthink. There are tides in the affairs of men. There are ideas which are dominant. And again, if you listen to particularly Cameron, Osborne, and Gove, they were obsessed with this idea of modernisation. Blair again. And what we can now see, of course, is that far from improving things, they absolutely made everything worse. That we had this extraordinarily flexible system of politics, the old world of the parliamentary constitution, which uniquely in Europe have been able to accommodate democracy. And remember, there's something we as Conservatives should be extraordinarily proud about. Once we'd recovered from the 1832 Act, which broke up the old monopoly on the parliamentary franchise, it is the Conservatives under Disraeli who begin the process of broadening the franchise to the working man in 1867. And what we should also draw enormous consolation from, that's the moment at which the liberal dominance of politics, which had run from 1832 to 1867, stops. In other words, the popular franchise is why conservatism has been the dominant political party in England. We've got to recover that confidence. You can see from the way the Labour Party believes, the desire to shut down Twitter, the desire to close down public opinion, they're frightened of it. They know it's fundamentally hostile to them, and because they can't, their appetite is to control everything. I mean, this absurd business of, as we've all just learned, we've now got to have a license to keep a chicken. But that was legislated under a Conservative government. So we can see, what I'm trying to explain is that none of this has happened by accident. This sense of dispossession, this sense of a politics which isn't working, of it doesn't make any difference which party you vote for, of economic stagnation, of the decline of our public environment, of hideous buildings, of this vile place that surrounds us here. I mean, I'm being serious. Just go outside here and look. This is the epitome of Blairite Britain. The sheer, hideous, destructive ugliness, and it doesn't work. Did you try to get into this bloody place in the pouring rain? But you look at the deliberate degree of inconvenience. Sorry, I really, this is systematic. It is genuinely systemic.
And what, therefore, do we need to do? Firstly, presumably, we need a leader of the... Yeah. What do we need? But I meant in order to get to that undoing point and that restoration point. But do we first need to have a
right leader? You see,
we first need to get the right leader and the right leader.
Sorry, Mark.
The right leader who buys into this, right?
Yeah.
So that we don't just have a list of retail offerings.
No. You see, again. Forgive me, I tend to think historically, because it seems to me, obviously it's my job, but it seems to me it's the fundamental way you explain human behavior. One of the great problems has been that instead we have had abstract so-called political science, which is just one abstract noun chasing another abstract noun, and the end product of it is a column by Danny Finkelstein in the Times, of this kind of abstract nouns chasing each other's tails with a nice little rabbi story at the beginning. And that's not really the way to do it. 1974 is the key that we should all be thinking about. This is at the end of a very similar process when the wartime coalition gives way in 51 to a Tory government that continues doing exactly the same things, that buys into the new Labour welfare state, that buys into nationalisation, that buys into a world in which the General Secretary of the Trades Union Council was automatically a member of the greater good and governor of the BBC and whatever, and it was Keith Joseph, and buys into Keynesian economics, the whole disaster, in which Margaret Thatcher was complicit under Edward Heath. And then in 1974, with the disaster of Heath's loss to Harold Wilson, you get Keith Joseph coming along and saying, he has like Robert Jenrick, he has a Damascene conversion. He realizes he was wrong. And again, I'm a passionate believer in that you have to admit when you're wrong. This idea we should think the same all the time and that it's somehow wicked to change our mind, this is a profound folly. Human beings learn by, if you're a believer in me, I'm like me, who is a believer in the inductive method of reasoning. That is, you reason from experience. By their fruits ye shall know them. I've always thought Jesus was a rotten theologian, but jolly good at politics. By their fruits ye shall know them. And what Keith Joseph said was, everything's gone wrong. This is why it's gone wrong. This is what we've got to do to put it right. But the problem was, in 74, he came up only with the economic problems. And he reduces conservatism simply to what you used to be, which is free market economics. So you see, he's undergoing a learning process too.
Very much at your knee, David, very much.
But I'm sorry, I'm being genuine and really serious. We should all be learning. If you stop learning, you stop living. And we've gone through yet another one of these terrible periods where people have stopped thinking.
And looking at this conference, delegates that you would have spoken to, but also the leadership candidates, and you've mentioned Robert Jenrick, and you've said you're keen for him to become leader. How confident are you that at various different levels of the party, that learning experience is happening and the right conclusions are being drawn from it?
Well, it would be impertinent, really, to try to summarize a whole conference. I've been immensely heartened by the events that I've been to. There's been a genuine sense of, I think it was Hunter down here who described it brilliantly. You can see I can pay tributes to other people as well as myself. But when he said that the main conference was a complete bore, nothing of any significance happened in the main conference. It's all on the fringe. It's in the hands of the membership. And the redeeming of the party has to be in the hands of the membership. And there is this sense of a genuine rethinking. Now, we may not get it right. It will be desperately sad if we don't. But there is that feeling, isn't there, everybody? There's that extraordinary feeling of energy, a slight degree of chaos. I love chaos. That these awful managed conferences where somebody gets up, utters 4 utterly banal words, and you get the kind of rugger club at the back going, "Rah!" And we have more than our fair measure of this in the Conservative Party, and it's jolly good, and I'm very fond of rugby clubs in the right and indeed the wrong places. But we need to be exercising our thought, our critical faculties, and I've got the feeling it's happening.
And amongst the leadership candidates, do you think Robert Jenrick has understood this, got it?
I think he is getting there again. This sounds impertinent, and I apologise. He's a work in progress. None of them is perfect. Margaret Thatcher wasn't perfect. Margaret, I remember, I'm so ancient, it was yesterday, and we all laughed at her. She had absurd little pussy bows. She had this strange sort of voice which lurched between Lincolnshire and received Oxford. She'd just been a disastrous Secretary of State for Education. She closed more grammar schools and turned them into comprehensive than anybody else. And then Keith Joseph gets to work on her, the Centre for Policy Studies, working very closely with the IEA. They come up with real new policies, which meant when she came in, not that she had it oven ready, she knew what she wanted to do, but she also had the cunning not to try to do it too quickly, because you'd take on the power of the trade unions. I think we'll be dealing with a very different situation. Because it's the government machine which is the problem, immediate legislation is possible. But it will have to be profoundly well prepared for, and it will have to legally absolutely watertight, because the blob will fight it to the end. Remember, what we have under Labour isn't government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. And we've got to prize that away.
So am I right, David? And after this question, I will come to the floor, so catch my eye. What you'd like, this would be an extensive piece of work, but the new Conservative leader needs to begin to piece together some form of Great Repeal Act, which would be presumably the first major piece of legislation.
It would be an enormous piece of legislation.
But would give us a kind of reset and a restoration to where we had been pre-Tony Blair.
Precisely.
You think that is the core sort of policy, strategic objective?
I think that has got to be. And my own view is, everything that if I am right, the next 5 years, or however long this government lasts, will be increasingly terrible. Everything that has got wrong will get worse. In other words, that it will be just like 1979. 1979 was as it were, complete concentration of everything that had gone wrong since the Second World War. And I remember vividly, that sense. I'd only voted Conservative once before that. And that sense in 1979, there was only one thing to do. And I think, providing we get it right, that will be the national mood. And again, it will be exactly 50 years on.
Let's take some questions from the floor. We've got Abigail and Chris have got microphones. Let me take the lady here, and then John 2 rows back, and then the lady on the far side there, just next to you, Abigail. Let's take those 3, and then I'll come back for another round. Please introduce yourself. You know the rules here if you've been here before. Introduce yourself, preferably ask a question, but you are allowed to give a speech of no more than one sentence that ends in a question mark.
And
you know
Mark,
the rules.
Keep a careful note, because I may not hear.
Right,
so,
sure.
Thank you.
Lindsay Sharrett, the Weekend. David, agree with you totally on the constitutional reforms. But on the identity question, this is quite dear to me. My PhD's on identity. We have completely lost control of the language, and we need to change the language so that people can understand what has gone wrong with the narrative.
I agree.
How do we do that? Because most people don't understand that's even a problem.
Okay, thank you. John, again, if you could introduce yourself.
John Strafford of Beaconsfield. David, under what you're saying, how do you protect the minorities? I am a smoker. I've been a smoker for 70 years, and I've had a great deal of pleasure, and I know the risks. And yet today, outside Wetherspoons this morning, I was stopped from smoking by a security guard who came to me and said, you must stop smoking, otherwise the traffic wardens will come along and fine you. Not only will they fine you, they'll fine us in Wetherspoons for allowing you to smoke. What do you think Winston Churchill would have said in those circumstances?
And probably stubbed it out on him, yes.
The lady here on the aisle.
Thank you. My name's Councillor Emma Supple from Enfield, and we're working under the 2000 Local Government Act. But I followed Tony Blair into Malawi, and his institute of Tony Blair Institute is having a profound impact on the developing countries, the poorer countries. And you talk about Juju, and you're talking about his agenda is global change. Should we not just be worried for the UK, but also for countries like Malawi? Thank you.
Interesting set. So just to remind you, David, or if you didn't quite pick it all up, Lindsay asked about identity and language. You do seem to have lost control of the language. One particular term that irritates, well, two actually that irritate me a lot. Liberal now means socialist, and progressive. I mean, I consider myself, I'm in favour of progress, but that's now associated with socialism as well. The devil has all the best tunes. John, on the protection of minorities, thank you, John, for being a smoker. Someone's got to pay tax, right? So I've often argued that giving up smoking is an aggressive form of tax avoidance. So, but this the story that John tells seems to be rather typical of modern Britain. This sort of nanny, sort of not quite bullying, but getting quite close to
very
it, the
close to
interference of
But
it.
you see,
and then Emma asks about Blairism across the globe, not just a British disease.
Right. Let's deal with language first. This is immensely difficult. One of the things I'm wanting to do, and discussing with Mark, I want us to publish a conservative primer, which will be a handbook. So one of the things we've all got to do, and sorry, I'm going to sound awfully teacher-like, and maybe our smoker will walk out in furious irritation, but we've all got to relearn ourselves. We've stopped talking about serious things. We need to understand how the idea of human rights has been stood on its head, how equality has been perverted, how this bizarre thing called the centre ground, which apparently all elections are won from, and nobody told Margaret Thatcher, you know. So there needs to be, so I think we've got to start educating ourselves, the country, our future leaders. We've got to be quite clear what we need a programme of proper civics in schools. How on earth can our children take over a great historical culture if they don't know anything about it? Or indeed if they've been presented with a perverted version. So we've got to be, and remember, what I'm saying is not new. George Orwell said exactly the same thing. This is why 1984 ends with an essay on language. But the right never took it seriously. And you know what? George Orwell identifies exactly the same problem, the overeducated middle class. There's that wonderful thing in The Lion and the Unicorn, in which he describes the typical supporters of socialism as fanatics, Quakers, sandal wearers, vegetarians, you know, and he goes on through this list of the absurd caricatures of the middle class character. Right, then smokers. Again, you see, COVID is this is why I said COVID is the quintessence of this new world. And remember, once again, we've forgotten all the great arguments. I can't remember which one of the founding fathers, it was probably several, actually said, if you trade freedom for security, you lose both. We have acquired this complete safety-first culture, which again, profoundly influenced by the European bureaucracy. But we've got consciously to argue against this. We've consciously, once again, to come up with the notion of freedom of choice. We've even got to learn to use the word freedom again. We've got to learn to use the word property again, that you have a property in yourself and your possessions. Because we've now got, particularly with the NHS, this view that in a sense, we're there to save the NHS, do you remember? We were locked up for months, supposedly to save the NHS. The way in which the individual, in an extreme form of deranged collectivism, again, as the left begins with freedom and ends with collectivism. It always, everywhere. An insane form of collectivism has taken over, with, of course, the NHS being the model. If we all pay for it, then isn't it wicked that we don't die promptly? You know, don't take up time in hospital. But again, it's language. It's ideas. And then finally, the lady who asked about Malami, absolutely right. Remember, this is a global doctrine. It's an idea that states are old-fashioned, that there's something better. It's also the terrible catastrophe of the United Nations. As we can now see with what's happening in the Middle East, the United Nations is as disastrous as the League of Nations. That the entire notion of international law is a perversion of good sense.
And the World Health Organization is a total disgrace.
They're all a disgrace. I mean, the special disgrace are the Human Rights Commission, you know, which has been chaired by Saudi Arabia. You know, Albania. I mean, and again, there's a wonderful book which everybody should try and read. It's not an easy book, by a man extraordinary. He's a Dane, but he's called Jacob Mchangama, a wonderful mixed race. And the book is all about how human rights were perverted deliberately by the Soviet Union and their satellites as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, was turned into the convention. And what they do, they use words that we haven't talked about, but there are the key words of the left: fascism. Why are the most implausible people, including me, accused of being fascist? Because it was the key word that the Soviets imposed on the Eastern Bloc as the justifier for excluding all right-wing opinion. This is why everything is called far right. So you see, these are universal problems. So we need, again, a broader set of horizons. And I'm delighted that. And of course, again, there are all sorts of catastrophes of Africa, aren't they? That when we withdrew from Africa, we assumed that you could just apply the same model that had been applied to the white Commonwealth. Absolutely catastrophic. I mean, we do have much responsibility, as well as good things.
Let me take a few questions from the front. Abigail, I'll take these two gentlemen on the front and the person in the second row there. Should just say on COVID, and which you mentioned in relation to smokers, David, the piece of scientific data that made my heart leap was that it became absolutely evident that if you were a smoker, you were
less likely to
die of COVID. So I think rather than locking us all down and investing in ventilators, the government should have sent a carton of Benson and Hedges to every household once a week.
The logic would have been to have made smoking compulsory.
Well, yes, that's the world we're in now. Everything's either banned or compulsory. On the front right here, sir, if you can introduce yourself.
John Davies, I'm from the Conservative Policy Forum, Huntingdonshire. Given what you said about the constitutional issues, which I think is very, very important, and trying to translate change into getting action for change, what three things do you think I could offer to a forum, feeding up from the local people in the local constituency to take upward, that would try and alleviate some of the problems you've outlined, please?
Thank you. Hunter Tuolong.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, it is. Yep. Hunter DeBose from the cities of London and Westminster. David, the pithy quote about liberty and security was Benjamin Franklin. And because I always enjoy taking great delight in correcting a national treasure of a historian that you are, you got the end of it just a bit wrong. What he said was those who would trade a modicum of liberty to gain some security Deserve neither.
Yeah.
And to end this on a question, would you prefer red or white wine for dinner?
What was the question?
Would you prefer red or white wine for dinner?
Oh, right, okay, well, there you go.
That's the question mark. That's the rules.
That's the most shoehorned in question so far. So if anyone can beat that in the 10 minutes we've got left. The gentleman just here in the second row.
Hi there. Is this on? It's working? Yeah. Patrick Simmons, Walls of Westminster. I am not in journalist mode. I was wanting to pick up on the point I think that you made, Mark, and obviously also with the doctor, about if we were going in one fell swoop, as it were, to repeal all of the change and the devastation that's come about since the New Labour days. You know, if it's one act, if it's a series of acts, just as our Constitution is. If you were governing, I'll ask this to both of you for the sake of it, if you were governing or if you were advising those who are governing, how would you campaign on that? How would you sell this one notion of, look, we need to do this one, it might be one thing, it might be several things, but it ends up being one overall package. How, in terms of campaigning being that's how actually you get elected to do it in the first place, how?
Okay. So just to remind you, David, John asked about the Conservative Policy Forum. I'm sure you're aware of it, but this is the the wing of the party that is supposed to feed up grassroots ideas. Hunter kindly corrected you on the precise nature of Benjamin Franklin's quote and wants to know whether you would like red or white wine.
It's very important to admit error.
And wants to know whether you want red or white
seriously,
wine for dinner.
Seriously, I'm not mocking. Really important to admit when you're wrong. The only shame is to pretend knowledge.
I agree. And then Patrick asked this interesting question, you know, how do we campaign for this? What's the pitch to the British electorate who probably just don't think in these terms, don't come to these sort of conferences, don't read the books about it? What is the thing that would get the broad sweep of the electorate? Say, oh yeah, I get it, I see why we need that, I see why we need to hit the reset
Labour's done
button.
our job for us. They've campaigned that Britain is broken. They've done the job for us. And it will be much worse broken. Sorry, is my microphone functioning?
Yep.
It will be much worse broken at the end of whatever number of years they survive. But what we've got to do, we've got to be relentless in pinning the blame. In other words, with each thing that goes wrong, we need a leader in the House and we need a front bench team that'll get up and say, right, this is the problem with clause whatever it is of the Human Rights Act. Right, this is the result of those absurd equations in the Equalities Act. In other words, and what we've got to do, we've to pin the responsibility on them.
But isn't the key thing, we don't just want the electorate to say, let's get rid of the red team and replace them with the blue team.
No.
We need the electorate to say, if we are replacing them with the blue team, we'll get this whole package of things.
What you're doing is you say, we've got to make sure that people understand the real disastrous consequences of each of these. So when there's a particular stupid decision by the judges and we have abundant choice, when you get judges ruling on whether or not you can carry out extractive things for fuel and whatever, or for they've even outlawed ore extraction and this sort of thing. We need a front bench team that is up to speed to say, right, this is why this has been done. Do you know how many jobs have been lost? Do you know what the economic consequences of this will be? This is the legislation. I would like actually to name the minister who was responsible. So in other words, you get the sense of, rather than just the yarbooery, we actually pin specific blame, link it to specific pieces of legislation, which is where I come to your point. Yeah.
On point you made, one of the things we've been pushing within the Conservative Policy Forum.
Just wait for the mic, nobody can hear you.
Wait for the microphone.
Relating to what you say, one of the things I push within the Conservative Policy Forum as our overall strategy should be responsibility and accountability, which seems to be an absolute key.
So just coming to George's point.
Yes, I heard. And let me give you a prime example. Do we all know why GPs do not work anymore? It is the pay settlement of Patricia Hewitt in, I think, 2008, who negotiated a settlement with the GPs in which out-of-hours care was valued. Would anybody care to come up with the figure at which out-of-hours care, in other words, nights and weekends, was valued at. In a settlement, remember, even then, the GP settlement was over 100,000. How much was out-of-hours care valued at? £10,000. Deranged. Not a single GP's practice in the country embraced it. Now, that is a gross error. It's a gross error of a civil servant. It's a gross error of a minister. And we've let them get away with it. And until we have a degree, it's fundamentally political education. It's the observation of what's gone wrong, and it's the pinning, as you said, of blame, rather than all this artificial stuff about lying and whatever. You know, we have a politics of charade in which you bring down somebody for eating a bit of cake, and somebody who has actually... I mean, Hewitt and that is directly responsible for the fact that GPs don't work anymore.
We're running a bit low on time, but let's take a question here. Then the lady there who's been waiting patiently in the third row, and then I'll finish back at the front. Gentleman there right on the aisle. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Alexander Mitchell, Kensington, Chelsea. So I'm very supportive of a Great Repeal Act. And I do wonder, should we have the abolition of our devolved parliaments as part of that? And
the abolition of
our devolved parliaments,
right?
And
I didn't catch that.
Of our devolved parliament, should
yes.
they be part of the right? Okay,
that's the question.
Then the lady behind you.
Thank you very much. Sue Osborne, Somerset councillor, so a change of geography here. And I think we can sometimes perhaps see that women have got to work a little bit harder to get noticed. My question to you is, we're soon going to have a new leader, whether we choose the right one or the wrong one. What would be the 3 pieces of advice you would give that newly elected leader on entering office?
Okay, and then we'll take Martin at the front. Well, we got one. I'm going to take one more question. If you're not going to, you don't want it. No. Okay, I'll take this gentleman at the front.
David, very earlier you mentioned about the Bank of England debauching the currency. Do you think the Bank of England should be abolished at some point?
There you go. 3 easy ones to end up on. Alexander asks about should the devolved administrations be abolished? Is that even politically possible? Sue asks about the 3 pieces of advice you give for our new leader upon entering office. Do you mean entering Downing Street or becoming the leader of the opposition? Upon becoming the leader of the opposition. The office being entered is the leader of the opposition.
And what's that 3 things?
3 things, and then the Bank of England. Should it be abolished, renationalised? Its mandate changed in some fashion?
Right, let's deal with the devolved administrations. In an ideal world, they would be abolished. It's perfectly clear they've worked terribly. For exactly the same reason there was union with Scotland. The politics are too small, so you get toy town politics. As I point out to everybody, the behaviour of the SNP in government demonstrates that Macbeth is not a play, it's a documentary. But it is probably not possible to do that. So I've got a typically modest Starkey suggestion. The reason why they are toy town is they have, like the wonderful remark of Stanley Baldwin, we're up in the Baldwin room recently, power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages. And the reason is they have got play money. They can spend money with no need to raise it. So I think we want a new devolutionary settlement, especially with Scotland, that would abolish the Barnett formula and give them full income tax raising powers.
Right.
So if they want to spend money, they've got to raise it. And if they want to spend more money than they do in Britain, then the Scots have got to be taxed for it.
Yep.
And at that point, I think the problem would mysteriously disappear.
They might rediscover Adam Smith rather quickly at that point.
They might actually go to Glasgow and rediscover Adam Smith, absolutely. The Bank of England is a highly debatable one, but it is perfectly clear that it has functioned every bit as badly as if you look at the catastrophe, particularly the office that's responsible for selling the national debt. In other words, selling bonds to the market. We are unique, can you believe it? When inflation is rock bottom, in other words, it can only go in one direction, 1/3 of bonds that were sold were inflation linked. I mean, what?
Yeah.
No, it's simply deranged. And I don't like defending Liz Truss, but she is basically right. It was the liability-driven investments, which the bank hadn't even noticed. It is simply, but once again, it is the fact they're not directly answerable. We've got a structure which deliberately protects these people. Again, the maddest thing was what we did with the NHS. You had Amanda Pritchard, who is called Chief Executive of the NHS, and my friend who used to run Boots said he wouldn't give her a job as a branch manager. But she's paid 200,000 a year to run a budget of how many 100 million?
Oh, yeah.
And no minister can actually tell. The minister carries all the responsibility and has none of the power. I mean, it is totally deranged.
And Sue asked for your 3 pieces of advice to the leader of the opposition, whoever he or she may be.
The first thing is they've got to admit this. They've got to recognise why we're in the mess that we are now. In other words, there has to be, effectively, what Robert Jenrick has done there is say, the last 30 years have been a disaster. We participated in that disaster. The second thing is to say what they will do to put it right, the kind of thing that I've been indicating. And the third thing is to stick to that point through thick and thin, to pin the blame on individuals, the party, the legislation, until it gets into, everybody gets sick of hearing about it, but every single thing that goes wrong will underscore it.
David, thank you. Listen, we are right up against the clock. Before I thank David, this is the last session here in Think Tent with PopCons for this conference, but I hope you'll join me in... I've been on stage and waxing lyrical, but I hope you'll join me in thanking the PopCon staff, Andrew and Nunziata, Angela, Martin, Sam, Ted, and thank you too to... all of the people who've given us some voluntary help, but particularly Hunter, Chris and Abigail, thank you so much indeed for helping us for no remuneration at all, just for the love of it.
How unconservative.
Just for the love of it. And our good friends from the TPA, Ben, William, Darwin, Joanna and Callum. It's been a big thing to put together and they've all worked tirelessly and this is their only chance to receive a little bit of thanks. So thanks to the Taxpayers Alliance as well. David, thank you, not just for being our guest at this conference, but for all of the work you're doing, which is really helping guide this, I think, exciting new movement of popular conservatism, which I think has really now caught the imagination of a large number of people in the party. So huge thanks to you. Dr. Starkey, thanks very much for all of you do, and for the brilliant hour we've just had with you. David. But my biggest thanks to all of you. There would have been no point in any of this work if you hadn't turned up. I was told actually that the queue around the block to listen to you, David, was longer than the queue for Robert Jenrick. So perhaps you should have thrown your hat in the ring to be the party leader. But my biggest thanks to all of you in the audience. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a very safe journey home. Thank you very much.